Volume's a little high? Is it too loud? Better? Yeah. Okay. We're going to talk about the Tarpon Club of Texas and the genius of E.H.R. Green, who was the guy that was the founder and money behind the club. In 1899, the Tarpon Club was the most expensive and exclusive club the world had ever seen. E.H.R. Ned Green located the club on St. Joseph's Island, adjacent to the Aransas Pass, and its membership was dubbed the first 400 sportsmen of America, a privileged group with more politicians and sportsmen than any other similar organization in the United States, whose wealth combined reached into the hundreds of millions of dollars. This is back in 1890 when $100 million is a lot of money, as if it's not today. The Tarpon Club members killed so many ducks that sharks congregated in the shallows near Harbor Island to gorge on the downed ducks before they could be retrieved. And club members, in pursuit of tarpon set and smashed records in the standards of the nascent sport of big game fishing. It was America's gilded sporting era. Ned Green opened the club in 1899. It was the most expensive, expansive, and exclusive club in the world. He selected the location for the club on the sand flats of St. Joseph's Island, across the channel from the lighthouse. And it was one of the last strongholds for huge numbers of wintering wildfowl, and the remainder of the year it was only rivaled by Texas for tarpon fishing. So this book came about because, first of all, I have a copy of the membership book. As far as I know, the only one in existence. And this guy, Rob Sawyer, wrote 3 books on wildfowl hunting in Texas. And I loaned him photographs from my collection. I collect postcards and images of primarily this area, 5 counties around Corpus Christi. And so I had loaned him a number of images for all these books. And I was reading the 3rd one, which is on top, and he wrote, this is my last book. And I got the feeling that maybe it wasn't. So I emailed him on a Saturday morning and said, how would you like to work on a book on the Tarpon Club? And at the time, I had a picture of the Tarpon Club, or several pictures of the Tarpon Club in the area, and I had the membership book. And so we decided that we would use those as a basis and do the research. And he did most of the research. And he was a joy to work with. In fact, I've got another idea that I'd like to get him to do. I don't know why this thing's going on and off. But don't fall asleep or it'll wake you up. Okay, so, whoops, one too many. E.H.R. Green, Ned Green. Green was his father's name. The H is Howland. The HDM1 cord between the computer and the seems to be loose. Yeah. What? Oh, we can't help it. I know it's a distraction. It was fine before we started. Is there another place to turn? Let's start by turning the lights on. If you'll just sit there and hold it, I think it'll be okay. Okay, so Ned Green was the son of Hetty Green, the Witch of Wall Street, popularly well known as the Witch of Wall Street, probably the world's greatest miser and the richest woman in the United States. And she sent him down to Texas to run the Texas Midland Railroad, and he got involved in politics, and that led to the Tarpon Club. And we'll get into that a little bit later. That's Hetty Green, the Witch of Wall Street. And she got that name because she always wore black, usually the same dress. It was of a heavy black cloth, and it wouldn't wear out. She prospered during the 1870s and 1880s by investing in undervalued U.S. dollars, bonds, and railroads. She hated lawyers, doctors, and the taxman, and called lawyers buzzards. And doctors, and she refused to pay the buzzard services until they sued her. She acquired a permit to carry her pistol, and one newspaper man declared that her intention was to shoot lawyers who become obstreperous in her presence. Doctors fared little better, for they were a bunch of robbers. Rather than pay for a hernia operation, she stuffed a stick between her clothing and her abdomen to apply pressure to her hernia so that she could get through the day. And she suffered pain for nearly 20 years rather than pay doctor's fees. And she actually, Ned had an injury as a young man, a sledding accident, and he had a bad knee. And it never got better. And then when he was 18, he was in an accident with a carriage, and she refused to take him to the doctor. And eventually gangrene set in, and his father finally took him to a doctor and paid the bill. And Ned had to have one of his legs amputated above the knee. So she was tight. You think? And the dog is Dewey. And in order to not pay taxes, she would move about every 6 months from apartment to apartment in Hoboken, in Newark, in New York City, so that the taxman could never keep track of her. And many of those leases were in the name of Dewey rather than her. She was a piece of work. And her grandfather was Isaac Howland Jr., and he founded a whaling company in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And her father went to work for the whaling company and then married Howland's daughter. And so Hetty was the offspring of that. The mother and a sister died at a young age, so Hetty was the only heir. And her father and grandfather would go to the office every day, and their eyesight was failing, and so she would accompany them, and she would read the financial papers of the newspaper to them. So she picked up all the financial acumen that they had. And so she became a real expert on money. This is a picture of their whaling works. Those are all barrels of whale oil. Her father was quite astute, and just before the Civil War, he sold off the company. And of course, in the Civil War, you may not know this, but the whaling ships were all commandeered by the U.S. government and taken to southern ports and sunk to blockade the ports. So he got out just in time. So Hetty bought the bonds of a bankrupt railroad, the Texas Midland Railroad, which was 52 miles long, and she sent Ned down to run it. And one journalist portrayed its tracks as a roadbed overgrown with grass and weeds, small rusty rails for want of use, and rolling stock dropping to pieces. The ancient-looking locomotives too weak to draw a good breath of steam, with sagging wooden branches and dilapidated stations. Well, Ned became a committed student to how to run a railroad, started asking questions and reading everything, and he put $2 million into the business, modernizing it with heavy gauge tracks, new wooden bridges, new stations. Steel became the bridge structures, and he extended the original 51 miles of track to 151 miles, and turned it into a real moneymaker. So he had a real business sense, and he got into the idea that he would run for governor of Texas. And so he allied himself with the Republican Party, and they had two factions in the Republican Party, the black and tans, which were the Negroes, and the lily whites, which were the non-Negroes. And he was allied with the wrong side because they were never going to let a black and tan run for governor. But in order to curry favor with the various factions of the Republican Party, he built this clubhouse. It was going to be limited to 400 people. It 400 members of the Tarpon Club. It was 12,000 square feet. Exterior colors were white with a roof of red and window trims and door trimming of green, and that's where the cover came from. And 12,000 square feet. The first floor housed private offices, a billiard room, kitchen, dining rooms, dance hall with a large open veranda. And you can actually see the veranda right over here. And fitted out with 126 electric lights. So they had their own power plant on St. Joseph's Island. And when the train would go through Ingleside and Aransas Pass up to Rockport, and gleaming across the water, you would see this building at night, all lit up. He had copper screens on each window, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful place out there on the sand, pretty much right across from where the lighthouse is today. So you can see it had a long pier that went out to the bay, and he used his political influence to get a post office there. And of course, if the post office was going to be a post office, it had to have a name. So he named the town Sport, Texas. And the only building in the town was this club. And the only people that were the citizens of Sport, Texas were the employees of the club. And we found the 1900 census for Sport, Texas, and there's 22 people that lived and worked at the club. Number one was E.H.R. Green. And so it's a pretty neat thing. So that census is in the book also. So let's go to the geology. Up here is the Aransas Pass that goes between St. Joseph and Mustang Island. And you would come through the pass, and in order to get anywhere, you had to go north. Up here is Rockport. That was the port at the time, because Rockport, this was all fairly deep water up to Rockport. You could sail a boat or get a boat up to Rockport. To get to Corpus Christi, they dredged a channel behind Harbor, through and behind Harbor Island and down the Morrison Cummings Cut, which is still there today. And if you go out fishing, the guides know it is Morrison's Cummings Cut. And then you would go across here to Corpus Christi. You could not get through Turtle Cove. It was about 2 feet deep. So until they put the port in, the only way to get to Corpus Christi was through the back of Harbor Island. So you can see it's a big, long trip. So this was not really a port in those days. It was all up there at Rockport. And so it's an idea of the geology of the area. And there's another pass down at the other end. This is Corpus Christi Pass. We drove here up today from Corpus Christi, and there was an 1852 pass, a Newport Pass, and Packery Channel, and 4 different passes that were all allowed water from Corpus Christi Bay to go through the Mustang Island. Only one pass per bay system, and only one at a time. So all the water out of Aransas Bay, which is up here by Rockport, would come down through this pass down to the Aransas Pass. So the Morrison Cummings Cut was dredged in 1874. So here's a closer up look of all of that. Here's the Aransas Pass, channel up to Rockport, Morrison Cummings Cut, Turtle Cove, Lighthouse is over here, and Sport, Texas is over here, and here's the town of Tarpon on Mustang Island. And here's the San Antonio and Aransas Pass Railroad over here, and it went all the way up to Rockport. That's where it ended. So if you were coming to the Tarpon Club, there's the railroad map for the San Antonio and Aransas Pass Railroad. If you were coming to the Tarpon Club, the best way to get there was to get to San Antonio, up here, and right here, and take the train down to Gregory and then up to Rockport. And at Rockport, you would get on a boat and go to the Tarpon Club, which would have been down here. 12 to 14 hours to get from San Antonio to Rockport by train in those days. And that's just a short part of the thing. You know, you still had to get to San Antonio by some of these other railroads throughout the Texas and then on to the East Coast. So needless to say, if you were going to go to the Tarpon Club, you had to go there on purpose. It was not a place that you happened to stop. So, to make things easier on everyone, Ned Green bought the first gasoline-powered boat in Texas, in South Texas, the Mabel, named after his girlfriend. And that's, whoops, went too far. That's the boat. It was, how long was it? It doesn't say. But it was about 80 feet long, and it would hold quite a few people. And so he would run that from Rockport down to the Tarpon Club. Then he would use it at his own personal launch for sailboat races and so forth. Named after his girlfriend, Mabel Harlow. So in those days, this was the beginning of sport fishing and hunting. Repeating shotguns had just been invented in 1882. The first pump gun was 1882, followed by Winchester's 1887 lever action gun. That allowed people to shoot ducks on the wing. Prior to that, if you were a duck hunter, you would use a gun and you would shoot sitting ducks, and in many cases they used what they called a punt gun, which was essentially a small cannon with a long barrel, and you would shoot a whole flock of ducks with, and hopefully kill 50 or 100 ducks and gather them all up. And this was for market hunters that were then selling them. They would ice them down and take them to a dealer who would then get them to the railroad, where they would go to either San Antonio or Dallas or even St. Louis. So repeating shotguns came into popularity. At the same time, fishing reels came, that had drag on them and anti-reverse handles. Prior to this time, if you wanted to control a wheel, you had moose hide on you put a moose hide on your thumb and held it on the reel to try to control its speed so it wouldn't all get out. So improved reels made it easier too. The first tarpon in Texas was caught in 1890. Before that, the technology did not exist to catch a tarpon. It was caught in Flower Bluff by a guy by a guy named J.S. Lockwood from San Antonio. And so that, amazingly enough, made national news all over the country that a tarpon was landed in Texas. And so it became a sport relatively quickly. And back in those days, if you were a Gilded Age businessman, businessmen competed in everything. So they competed in who had the biggest company, who made the most money, who caught the biggest fish or the most fish, who shot the most ducks. They competed in everything. So the Tarpon Club was the perfect place for them to come and compete. So there's a picture of the first of tarpon fishing in South Texas. And so they fished from rowboats, and you would have a guide that would row you out there, and they would row along, and hopefully the tarpon would take your lure. And fishing for the Silver King or tarpon, the epicenter became Port Aransas, or at the time it was called Tarpon, Texas, in the pass. And they would actually row along the pass and try to get a tarpon to take the lure. And that's the world record tarpon, caught in 1899 by C.W. Dawley, 7 foot 10.5 inches long. That's a big fish. Caught on rod and reel. He was a member of the Tarpon Club, so he caught it at the club. And for several years, it was displayed at the Tarpon Club. And then eventually, when the Tarpon Club closed, it went up to the Bayside Inn in Rockport. This postcard actually says that the weight is 230 pounds. Big, big fish. So I happen to have, I think, probably the only copy of the membership book in existence from 1899. And it had 334 listed names. 200 were from Texas, over 200, 49 from Illinois, 43 from Missouri, 29 from Colorado, and other states, including New York, Pennsylvania, Arkansas, Massachusetts, all over. One man came from Canada. And the occupations of the men were attorneys, judges, bankers, physicians, surgeons, railroad men, capitalists, and those with ties to insurance, real estate, oil, steel, manufacturing, mining, and newspapers. So the full gamut of businessmen and politicians, including state governors and senators and mayors. And Greene was a great publicist, and he announced that Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson were members of the club. They were not, but he announced it anyway. Other members, Edwin Gould, who was the son of the Jay Gould, Isaac Elwood of American Steel and Wire, J. Warren Gates, better known as Betamillion Gates, who initially brought barbed wire to Texas and he staged in San Antonio. He surrounded the plaza in San Antonio with barbed wire and turned longhorns loose in it, and they wouldn't go through the wire, and that's what enabled him to start selling barbed wire in Texas. And he eventually got into manufacturing his own wire, got into steel, oil, and railroads, and was one of the richest men in the country. And C.P. Huntington, who was a railroad baron from California, and he was Greene's mother's enemy, but that didn't stop Greene from letting him in the club. In Texas, J.A. Baker, head of the Baker law firm, was a member. James Hogg, former governor. Jesse Jones, Houston banker and businessman. And then John G. Kennedy from South Texas, and Robert Clayburgh. And the only other member from the area was E.A. McCampbell, who was a prominent lawyer in Corpus Christi. So only 3 South Texans. But they represented, Kennedy and Clayburgh represented 2 of the largest ranches in the state and in the nation. So the club prospered. First 2 years, over 200 members came to Corpus Christi. Caught a lot of tarpon, shot a lot of ducks, and so forth. And then the publicity started to die. And Greene, by that time, was no longer going to be, they decided he was no longer going to run for governor. So he started losing interest, and he got interested in automobiles. He bought the first automobile in Texas, and he took it from Greenville to Dallas. It took 6 hours. And I think he had to pay $12,000 to people whose horses were scared along the way and caused damage. But automobiles took off. He sponsored automobile races in Houston and Dallas. He was talking about a big race down in South Texas, but never came off. But the membership book lists the 334 members, and so we have taken each one of those members and looked up where they were from, what they did for a living, and so that all that information is in the book also. So the club, after 2002, pretty much was getting run down. And in 1904, at the end of the year, this article appeared in the Corpus Christi Caller, that the Greene's fine clubhouse had been purchased by J.J. Copley and will be moved to Corpus Christi at once. And Copley had bought a hotel called the Alta Vista Hotel, which was 3 miles south of downtown Corpus Christi. It's what the place was called 3 Mile Point. And it's today, if you know where the McKinnon House is on the S-curve, it's there. That's where that club was. And Copley, it was built in the 1890s by Elihu Ropes, but never finished. And so it needed interior work as well as the piers and the outbuildings and so forth. So Copley bought the club for $8,000. Now, Greene had supposedly built the club for $30,000, but he bought that and the ship and all the furnishings for $8,000. And he tore the clubhouse down stick by stick and brought it to Corpus Christi and finished off the Alta Vista. And so that opened in 1905, only to close in about 1908 because it was too far out of town. Excuse me. And there was nothing to do. I mean, think about on the bluff in Corpus Christi along the bay. What else was there to do? So it failed. So the club is gone. Green went on to many other things. He got interested in radios. He built his own radio station. He had concerts from his home in Massachusetts. He got into stamp collecting. He got into coin collecting. He was researching, was a brilliant man, so he did a lot of research on electronics and radio and so forth. He had his own blimp. He had his own airfield at the at his home. He actually had an airport there where pilots could come in and land, and Lindbergh actually went there and stayed with him for a couple of days. So he walked away from all of this down here after he sold it. So there's interesting things. I've added a couple slides to the talk because I find them so interesting. This one is a map of the evolution of the pass, of Aransas Pass. And so here is the lighthouse up here on Harbor Island. And you can see right here is a channel. That channel is 1853. So that's where the pass was in 1853. By 1868, it had moved south. 1871 further south. 1878 this was a channel. 1876, the Mary, 300-foot steamship, wrecked here at the mouth of the pass. And so then the government finally decided that they were going to stabilize that pass so it wouldn't move, so it was safer. So first thing they did was build a groin along here to keep Mustang Island from moving. So if it didn't move, then St. Joseph's Island couldn't move. And then eventually they built the jetties out here to stabilize the pass and stabilize the... I'll try. Better? Okay. So the pass has moved. The pass would move up to 280 feet a year. And I talked about the other end of Corpus Christi where there's 4 passes. Same thing happened down there at Corpus Christi Pass. They kept moving south. Now eventually they would move so far and then a hurricane would come along and reopen a pass up north and the whole process would start all over again. So at one time there was a settlement up here on St. Joseph's Island. When Zachary Taylor came, he landed at the Aransas Pass and he opened a warehouse up here, and so there was a settlement called Aransas. Well, the Yankees burned that in the Civil War. So after the Civil War, the first settlers came and started living on Mustang Island. And some of those settlers were the Mercers who became the pilots, and they're still, I guess, involved in the community, and we're next door, we're in the Mercer house. So the Mercers were one of the settlers. So by 1880 or so, they had stabilized it, so Port Aransas was no longer, the Mustang Island was no longer moving south. But I find that just really fascinating, how those channels moved, and I had no idea it was 280 feet a year until I found some research on it. So another interesting thing is the Tarpon Inn. It was built in 1886 to house the workers from that were working on the jetties. And the Tarpon Club only had 18 bedrooms. So when they had overflow, they started sending the guests to the Seaside Hotel. This was called the Seaside Hotel until 1898, when the owner renamed it the Tarpon Club Annex, because people that were at the Tarpon Club and couldn't stay there would come to the Tarpon Club Annex. And then eventually, when the Tarpon Club died, it became the Tarpon Inn. And it has remained the Tarpon Inn all those years. But this building was heavily damaged by the 1919 hurricane. And then it had a fire thereafter. So it was torn down, and the current structure was built in 1925. So the Tarpon Inn that we know today replaced this. And then, as I said, Green got interested in in stamp collecting and so forth. He was the second largest collector of stamps after King George of England. And this is probably the most famous American stamp. It's the inverted Jenny, the JN4 plane They issued 100 stamps on one sheet with the inverted Jenny up on there, and Green bought the entire sheet from a stamp dealer for $15,000. And then he used the dealer to come out slowly but surely and kept on raising the prices. And so Green was a pretty good businessman. Some of those stamps now go for $100,000 today. When he died, his stamp collection and his postage collection, or his coin collection, both took over $100,000. Over 6 auctions over 2 days to sell. So that's some of the story. We've got all the people that lived that were members in there. When Rob was working on the book, he discovered that his great-grandfather was a member of the club. Had no idea. So maybe some of your great-grandfathers were members of the club. Who knows? It's a fascinating story. We had a great time learning about it. We did not know that the Seaside Hotel was called the Seaside Hotel. We assumed it was a Tarpon Inn, but it makes sense. It was built in 1886 before the town of Tarpon took the name Tarpon. Prior to that, it was Ropesville. So just a lot of fascinating history that we learned that we didn't know existed until we got into this book. Just a lot of fun. So, Valentine's Day is coming. What better gift than a book that, you know, if you give them a box of candy or flowers or something like that, it's gone in no time. But a book will be with you for a long time, and you can share it with friends and so forth. So I have brought a few books with me, and I brought some of my other books too, the ones that are more, cover more of Texas. I left the Corpus Christi stuff at home. But all of my books are $45. This is the Tarpon Club of Texas. I think you'll enjoy it. I know it, I don't know how many times I've read it. It's just a really fascinating book. You learn so much. And so those are some of our other books. I didn't bring the Corpus Christi books or the Columns books, but I brought those other ones and several others. So they're all $45. I'll pay the tax. You won't have to have shipping, so just an even $45. And you can do cash, checks, or credit cards. And if anybody's got any questions, I'll try to answer questions. But I can't see you. Yes?
How did you come by
I came by the membership book because, you want to tell them, Mark? You know the story. I collect postcards of Corpus Christi. I've got a collection of Corpus Christi area, so I got a whole bunch of up here too that I've shared with the PAPHA. But my total collection's over 6,800 cards. And so I'm on eBay every night. And one day this membership book for the Tarpon Club popped up on eBay. And I paid, at the time, a lot of money for it. I have no idea. But I paid $101.78 for that membership book, which at the time was a lot of money to me. Thank God I did. And then, so that, and there's a cup and saucer in the or a creamer and sugar in the museum that have Tarpon Club on the side, in a case right on the other side of the, right by the entrance. And so I came up, Cliff met me here on a Saturday morning. We took some pictures of that. So those are in there. Those are the only 3 artifacts that I know of from the club that still exist.
What was the membership in the club? How much did it cost?
It's a $500 initiation fee and $50 a year. That's the equivalent of $50,000, something like that. It's a lot of money in those days. Whether they paid it or not, I don't know. He was using this to promote things, so he may have given it away, but the membership book actually says those numbers in there. And he had more applicants than he had spots for it.
You mentioned the different states that the members are from. You meant in your book you list what cities?
Every member is listed alphabetically with what town they were from, what company they worked for, what positions they held, some of their civic activities. Yeah. Ned was able to go through and he searches old newspapers, so he went like to Dallas. If somebody was from Dallas, he went to Dallas and searched for that person's name until he found them. So it's really fascinating. Yes, sir.
Is the multi-generation E.H. Green
Nope.
not related?
E.H.R. Green never had any children. He married his girlfriend at age 43. They never had any kids. His sister also married in her 40s, and she never had any children. So she died last. He died first, left everything to her. And she left about $80 million to charity. Ned inherited $40 million from his mother. He died with $40 million. He still had the original inheritance, but all the income off of it he spent like a drunken sailor. And doing good stuff, interesting stuff with it. So no relation to E.H. Green, the car dealer. I've been asked that a number of times. Yeah. Anybody else? Well,
So you show the channel, I think it was late 1800s. How does that compare to the present channel?
it's there. This is where the present channel is. It was stopped.
So with the jetty now it's...
The jetty is not moving. Right.
That's our fourth jetty.
Okay.
And it stopped moving in 1885, but they never got it to work until 1912.
Okay. So 1912 was the fix.
That's when the depth started to stay steady. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Isn't the original tip for the Mansfield jetty or the South jetty failed?
Did you know did you hear that? What happened to the Mansfield jetty? It failed, didn't it? Yeah. These guys know more than I do.
The North Jetty actually was originally designed by an engineer named PAPHA, and it was actually designed as a mid-channel jetty, and that was before 1900, late 1800s. And in fact, when the Army Corps engineers were supposed to deflect the S-curve and the shape of the North Jetty was supposed to deflect the currents and actually deepen the channel and stop the migration of the channel. It didn't work, but it was extremely well built, probably the first one out of all the attempts. And when the Army Corps engineers built the South Jetty, they tried to blow up the S-curve North Jetty, which, like I said, started in the middle of the channel, but then it was much further north. But they weren't able to extract it, so they just ended up attaching it and adding to it. So that's why we have one curved jetty and one straight jetty, which supposedly that's the only curved jetty in the U.S.
Okay.
How old are the granite blocks? The current granite blocks, how old are those?
So they go back all the way to the beginning of the 20th century.
Early 1900s, yeah. There's pictures of them putting the big granite blocks down. Marble Falls. They're
Even the replacement was after Harvey also came from Marble Falls.
You said the Tarpon Club was torn down and moved to Corpus.
the Tarpon Club was torn down. The wood was taken over to Corpus. Yeah. It burned in 1927. It had been deserted from like 1908 or 1909 to 1927. It was a big white elephant on the bayfront south of town. And if you actually go downtown to Peoples and Schatzel and drive 3 miles south on Ocean Drive, on the left is the home of Sandy McKinnon, and that's where it was. Yes?
Jim, you've got quite a bit more information on Mabel, and perhaps you shared some of it.
Oh. People want to know that Mabel she was a hooker. And Green was a naive young man. He was good looking, as you saw in the picture, 6'4", only one leg. So he was a little bit naive. He did well, but he went to Chicago and was running his mother's investments in Chicago. And he made friends very easily, and a couple of the friends decided he needed to be introduced to the ways of the world, and they took him to a house of ill repute. And Mabel taught him the ways of the world. And the classic story, he fell in love with a hooker. Mama made him go back to New York City, and then sent him to Texas. Mabel got married and went with some guy to California. And then Green, when he was in Terrell, Texas, hung out with a bunch of bachelors. He bought the opera house and turned the upper floor into a bachelor pad and would have girls up there. And one day, who shows up? One of the girls coming from Dallas, but Mabel. And she was with him the rest of the way. Mama called her Mabel Harlot, not Harlow. And she made him promise not to marry till he was 40. Mama died. He married at age 43, and he married Mabel. And she outlived him. He had a prenup with her that she would get $125,000 at when he died. She sued the estate, and I think she settled for $500,000, which in the 1930s was a lot of money. And so she died in, I think, the early 40s. So she's a fascinating character, too. And we don't have a picture of her in there, but I was so disappointed when I saw her picture. I was expecting to see this ravishing-looking redhead, and she was, by the time they had pictures of her, she was not that. Let's put it that way.
Did you talk in your book about the flags and the guide flags that they used over there?
No, we may have mentioned those. Yeah, I think we did, that the club would fly a different flag or pennant up at the top when they needed a fisherman to come over, and because locals were not allowed in the building, period. So they had to come over and would only come over and be able to get into the, and then the sportsman would come out on the dock and come down to the boat. So they would fly flags for that to let them know what they needed, whether it was a duck guide or a tarpon guide or so forth. And they also ran sailboat races. There's a chapter on sailing, which I didn't talk about. Rockport. Rockport was the resort at the time because the railroad went to Rockport. So Corpus Christi really, that was not in the 1880s, 1890s, was not a resort. So the resort was Rockport. And so wealthy people, primarily from San Antonio, ended up in Rockport. One of the things they did was sailboat racing. So sailboat racing had been going on. Green came down and started sponsoring the races. Had a big 2-foot tarpon club trophy made. And some brothers, the Bloodworth brothers from Rockport, were winning all the races in a boat called the Novice. And they won it for 3 or 4 years in a row. So finally, somebody asked them for the plans of the Novice, and one of the Bloodworths said, well, we haven't gotten around to putting that down on paper yet. They just built it by the seat of their pants. But they eventually moved to Galveston, which was the other big racing center, and had a lot more money. And so they were boat builders up there for many years. Fascinating stuff. I mean, we learned so much. I'm a student of local history, and thought I knew a lot until we got into this book. It was just fascinating. And this was all primarily stuff in newspapers from around, primarily Texas, but wherever there were members, there would be newspaper articles. Green was a great publicist, as was his mother. When he was running for, when he wanted to run for governor, Mama, as I said, only wore dour black clothes. Well, she got all dressed up, went to Washington, D.C. in fine clothes and stayed in the best hotel and ate in the best restaurants and entertained the politicians in Washington, D.C. And I was just shocked when I heard that. It was so out of character for her. But anything for her son, I think, was except Mabel, was the game. Yes?
Who owns San Jose Island now, and who owns that property that he was on?
The Bass brothers own the entire island. At the time, Green rented the island. We mentioned the names, and I don't recall them. But in 1927, an oil man by the name of Sid Richardson bought the island. Then when he passed away, he left it. Richardson never had any children, so he left that island to his nephew, Perry Bass. And today it's owned by Perry Bass's sons, the Bass brothers. And so they own it, the entire island. I wanted to go over and see where the Tarpon Club was. And I talked to the foreman of the island, and he told me that there is nothing left. There's one concrete slab, which I think the other thing that I didn't talk about, but after the Tarpon Club died, in 1916, there was a Manhattan fish processing factory built in the same site that would catch Manhattan, or small oily fish about this long that are run in May and June and July. They catch them and turn them into oil. And so they built that factory. It opened on May 1st, 1916. And in August of 1916, it was wiped off the face of the earth by the 1916 hurricane. So it's no longer there either. But as I said, I collect postcards of the area, and I have 3 or 4 postcards of the Manhattan factory. As far as I know, they're the only ones in existence.
Are your postcards documented anywhere? Is it a book or is it exhibited?
No. Mark came over one time and spent 3 days scanning all of them. So the Rockport cards are on your computer in here, over there, in the office. And
And we allow people on, we have over 37,000 images.
yeah, mine are only about 1,000 of those images. They keep track of who donates images. I'm number 2. I think Mark Young is number 1. So, but yeah, I find it very interesting, because the stuff I collect, you just never know what you're going to find. There was a camp in Corpus Christi called Camp Scurry. It was a Army camp, open from 1916 to about 1918 or 19, and it had the world's greatest football team in it. They they won 8 games against other Army camps, outscored their opponents 432-6, and they were made of post-college players. They were all Army reservists that were in Corpus Christi. So I claim that's the world's greatest football team. And if I can get Rob Sawyer interested in that, that's the next book he and I are going to work on, because his research skills would be great for that. So you just never know what you're going to find.
So how long have you been collecting postcards?
Over 30 years.
So prior, so some of them come from eBay. Where do you get most of them?
eBay.
Really?
Oh, yeah. One day at one time I was buying 1 postcard at least a day
Well, that's
for
great.
several years.
People had the foresight to put them out there to know there's some value.
Well, they're trying to make money.
Yeah, well, it's great. But,
Yeah.
the chronicles of this.
That's how I met Mark. Mark was complaining because some guy in Corpus Christi was buying all the cards. And Port Aransas couldn't get any of them. And so he finally called me up and he said, "How come you're buying all those cards?" And I said, "It's my hobby." He says, "Well, how do I get in?" And he said, "Well, you can copy all of them you want." And so we have a happy marriage now, right? So I'll share them. It's a fascinating hobby, and I've got stuff that nobody else has, besides me, has probably ever seen. Yes, ma'am.
Not to start a frenzy or anything, but wouldn't that club have dumped all its bottles and extra stuff right out the back of the building for people to say, go pick up?
I have no idea.
They wouldn't have started in the early 1900s. They wouldn't have started that. I mean, they wouldn't have been thoughtful about that. They would have just dumped it outside.
Who knows? I have no idea whether they sold it. First of all, it may not have been monogrammed. So it may have just been stuff that went to the Alta Vista. I wouldn't want to speculate.
Glass and their trash from food. They serve food. They have restaurants. They have food service.
They served the finest seafood you could find, which was all over the place. Turtles. Well, you go see the Bass Brothers.
Where is that on San Jose? Is it still there, or is it in the bay? Right?
It's still there. It's on land. Yeah, it's still there.
One more question. There's a concrete jetty of sorts that's 2 or 3 feet high that goes perpendicular to the coast, close to the lighthouse. What was that?
No idea. People were building things all the time. I know that all the Tarpon Club stuff was wood. I have other pictures that show the pilings and so forth for the pier.
I heard that they were trying to channel the water back through there.
Yeah. It could have been by one of the previous owners of the lighthouse or the Army Corps of Engineers. I have no idea. One of these guys would know more than I would know. It's their territory. Okay, well, I'll be available in the back. I'll sell you books. I can take cash checks and credit cards. And I'll answer questions back there. Thank you.